are much higher food prices and much worse shrinkflation coming soon. So this article came out a few days ago from Robert Wheeler from the Organic Prepper blog. It was on Zero Hedge. From Monday, October 12th, food shortage simulation predicts 400% increase in food prices by 2030. Yeah, if they're going to be actually honest, maybe. So recently, he wrote an article discussing, the author, Robert Wheeler, wrote an article discussing the looming food crisis in the United States and the rest of the world. While it may seem like paranoia to some readers, and honestly, there's been biblical type of crazy weather all over the world, especially in China, the last 70 or 80 days, including droughts in certain parts of China, and then record 70 or 80 years worth of that rains and flooding that China has not, the mainland China has not seen that type of rains and flooding in 70, 80 years, where that super high, tall Buddha statue, it actually got up all the way. That's normally a tourist attraction. That's normally, if it gets to the feet, it's normally going to flood massively, and it got up there. So it's the devastated crops. There's tons of videos interviewing with farmers of their entire staple crops being just flooded and destroyed. There's videos of, on China in Focus, one of the top China news channels, of farm animals being swept away in the floods. It's just really sad. There's also been bad weather or bad crop harvests all over the globe. There's been weather problems for U.S. farmers with bad crop harvests over the last couple of years with either flooding or droughts in different parts. I believe some Brazilian crops were underplanted and there was problems there, and there's been problems as well that I've covered in past videos since the pandemic started in Africa and elsewhere, where other countries were actually talking about or had already done so of restricting food exports on certain staple crops. So, looming food crisis in the United States, rest of the world. While it might seem like paranoia to some readers, the information provided in that article is very real. In fact, he's not the only one that's been thinking about it. Back in 2015, 65 people showed up at the World Wildlife Fund, which got in a lawsuit with the World Wrestling Federation for the WWF. Headquarters in Washington, D.C. These individuals were international policymakers, corporate businessmen, academics, and, quote, leaders in thought. Their goal was to run a simulation of a world food crisis that would begin in 2020 and run to 2030. I'm sure Alex Jones at InfoWars is covering this one. The press release of the event was published on the Big Ag Corporation Cargill website and revealed that the food shortage simulation that the decade between 2020 and 2030 would see two major food crises. During this time, prices would rise 400% by 400% of the long-term average. There would be a number of climate-related weather events. Governments, although there's allegations that the U.S. has used a weather weapon, governments would be, conspiracy theories, would be toppled in Ukraine, and I know about HARP, but still conspiracy theory, would be toppled in Ukraine and Pakistan, and famine would force refugees from Myanmar, Chad, Sudan, and Bangladesh. Does any of this sound familiar yet? In the simulation, one governmental solution was a tax on meat. Another government solution, and I'm using air quotes, a global carbon tax, which then the Wall Street banks like Goldman Sachs can do carbon cap and trade, which then Joe Biden, if he's going to implement those taxes on stocks, bonds, real estate, dividend stocks, maybe then that's how he bribes the Wall Street banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. He gives them new business for the Green New Deal or carbon cap and trade and say, hey, Wall Street banks, here's extra tens of billions of dollars or billions of dollars a year, tens of billions of dollars a year in new manipulation profit taxes on these new markets. And I'm using air quotes. The press release started on Monday and Tuesday. 65 international policymakers, academics, business, and thought leaders gathered at the World Wildlife Funds. The WWF, after the lawsuit was won against the World Wrestling Federation, which is now World Wrestling Entertainment, headquarters in Washington, D.C., to game out, this is like a war game kind of, how the world would respond to a future food crisis. The game took the players from the year 2020 to 2030. As it was projected, the decade brought two major food crises with prices approaching 400% of the long-term average, a raft of climate-related extreme weather events, governments toppling in Pakistan and Ukraine, and famine I wonder if that would hurt the Biden family. And and famine and refugee crises in Bangladesh, Myanmar, Chad, and Sudan. Climate hunger, civil unrest, and spiking food prices came together at the food chain reaction game in Washington, D.C. this week. Cooperation mostly won the day, along with the WWF, the Center for American Progress, which is hardcore like Hillary Clinton, the Podesta brothers, all those, the Clinton, most of the people in the Clinton state, the revolving door between lobbyists, hardcore Democrat lawyer lobbyists, the Obama State Department that Hillary Clinton ran, and then also the DNC. And then also the Clinton Foundation. The Center for American Progress, I believe one of the Podesta brothers founded the Center for American Progress, if I'm not mistaken. And the Center for Naval Analyses. Cargill was one of Food Chain Reaction's organizers. The company was represented in the game by Corporate Vice President Joe Stone. Remember, these are like the same people like AOC that says we're going to have to stop eating meat. And then she's caught like the next day at Shake Shack just gulping down hamburgers. Over 2 days, the players divided into teams for Africa, Brazil, China, the EU, India, the US, international business and investors, and multilateral institutions crafted their policy responses as delegations engaged in intense negotiations. Of course, working, quote, globally turned out to be the most beneficial. Oh, globalists. Cooperation mostly won the day over the short-term individual advantage. Teams pledged in this, food war game to build international information networks and early warning systems on hunger and crops together, invest jointly in smart agricultural technology, and build up global food stocks as a buffer against climate shocks. Markets would work if people would actually let them. In the face of a steep, that's my analysis there, but, there's a lot less markets now. Or whatever's left of them. In the face of a steep, or as Chris Powell of Gold Antitrust Action Committee says, there are no markets anymore, only different degrees of manipulations. In the face of a steep price spike with looming global food shortages in 2022, the European Union at one point suspended this is still a war game, suspended its environmental rules for agriculture and introduced a tax on meat. Both measures were quickly reversed in 2025 as harvests went back to normal and tensions eased on the hypothetical universe. Carbon and meat taxes are a possibility. The most eye-catching result, however, was a deal between the U.S. and European Union, India and China standing in for the top 20 greenhouse gas emitters to institute a global carbon tax and a cap of CO2 emissions in 2030. Quote, we've learned that a carbon tax is a possibility in years ahead. And then let me add that Wall Street banks can make billions of dollars, and then all the lobbyists and all the government contractors and the Department of Energy handing out unbidded contracts to their buddies, like with Solyndra and Fiskar and all the other shenanigans. Trump administration does it too, but both political parties, they all just loot. The political appointees, the bureaucrats, and the government agencies got in an argument with a supposed government employee, saying that business people, CEOs and business people, are the greediest and the worst and evil. And I was like, I've lived in the Washington D.C. metro area for 20 years now, and government employees, lobbyists, government contractors, they're also greedy, very greedy. They're also evil. I've met ones that have bragged about stealing and have gotten away with it. They said they did it 10 years ago or way past statute of limitations. This is just how life works around here. It's all swamp creatures. Quote, we've learned that a carbon tax is a possibility in years ahead, that Wall Street banks could make billions of dollars extra from acknowledged stone and destroy the economy even more. But before we can consider moving ahead with a measure like that, we must study it and understand it much better. We have to avoid sudden market distortions and unforeseen consequences. There is no market. There is no capitalism. It's all central planning, government central planning, and all the central banks then have an excuse to print trillions, tens of trillions probably, in more currency for the Green New Deal and to allocate capital. It's not really capital at that point. It's just currency. Currency and credit, however they see fit. It's all just phony currency and monopoly money. Stone said he was Stone said he was impressed with the complexity of the food war game and the second and third order consequences of some of the decisions that were taken. Quote, take the meat tax Europe wanted to impose and think through that. What meat are you going to tax? Here's where it's just going to make things even worse. Does that mean poultry and beef or aquaculture? I guess that's the fish farms as well. Where do you levy the tax? Where does the money go? What are the unintended consequences? So this is just even more distortions by politicians, bureaucrats, government central planners that they're going to just blame on capitalism when they're really just making things even worse with economic central planning. And then the central banks are just going to print even more currency and hand out even more credit. And if the loans go bad, oh, don't worry, just more currency. They'll paper it right over right quick. The game was built over the course of months with maximal realism in mind. The scenario was extrapolated from events that have actually occurred in the real world, such as the food crisis of 2008-2009, or the recent string of hottest years and months on record. Cargill economist Tim Bowden, who helped design the food war game and sat on the judges panel that evaluated the team's moves, said he was surprised by the degree of cooperation. Quote, most people started out with a short-term perspective, but transitioned to long-term measure pretty quickly. They started working to strengthen resiliency instead of just putting out fires, end quote. Keep in mind this press release and the exercise took place in 2015, yet it's almost as if they're reading the script for 2020. That's the additional editorial note here at the below the war game press release. And then it says here, last paragraph, there's a clear agenda. The fact is, as we know, there is an agenda for all of these things. Food shortages, meat tax, global carbon tax that the Wall Street banks will profit from, and there will be even more waste, fraud, corruption, and abuse for the swamp creatures and parasites here in the DC metro area to hand out unbidded government contracts to their friends and then get director of boardship, either stock options or seats on board of directors in the revolving door that happens in pretty much every single government agency here with both political parties. Because the name of the game here is lie, cheat, and steal as much as you can for 6 to 8 figures per year. Global carbon tax, and if COVID has been anything, it has been the most helpful little virus to ever have existed. That is, as long as you're a member of the global feudal overlords. Oh, I like how you call them global feudal overlords. Because we are far along now on the road to serfdom. If you've been reading my articles, okay, the last of it here is just promoting another article on self-reliance for growing your own food. The rest of the article, if you want to take a look at some of the other articles he linked to about at the beginning here, let me go back. It was Looming Food Crisis. The other article and some of his other articles on growing your own garden will be linked below the video in the information and description section. So, for the last 4 or 5 months, I've been collecting a lot of different articles on shrinkflation, higher food prices, governments deciding whether or not they're going to ban exports or reduce exports, at least on certain food crops. There was an interesting article, let me pull up. I had a PowerPoint slide. I was going to make this into a short little video, but those don't get really any views now. My live stream videos are actually getting a lot of views, but I'm only getting $5 now per video in Google AdWords revenues because YouTube's just totally screwing me over. Okay, so this article came out on September 1st from Reuters, and it was Factbox, Americans on lockdown pay more for groceries, clothes, and appliances. And they actually looked at 21 U.S. consumer items, and they all had rapidly rising prices. This article came out the first week of September, on September 1st, and there was pretty rapidly rising prices on a lot of different things. So prices rose at that point 16.5% in 4 weeks for eggs. And they have a number, yet the problem is not limited to failed states or developing countries. Food insecurity is also rising. Nations as rich as the U.S., where more than 1 in 5 households report they do not have enough to eat. Food bank lines have grown longer during the pandemic, and school closures have meant that some children who depended on school for a daily meal have missed out. That food costs are rising now might seem counterintuitive in a world where energy prices, a key input in food production, remain low. But you have weather problems all over the globe. You also have the African swine flu, which is it was over a year ago. It started over a year ago, but that still did immense damage to the global pork population, and Chinese demand for pork is still immense. So, but the U.S. and China has been importing a massive amount of pork. China, I believe, owns Smithfield Foods. They bought it a while ago. They also have a very big investment into Tyson Foods, and they were exporting an enormous amount of pork. Both Smithfield Food and I think Tyson Foods had a 600% increase in exports to China for pork. a few months ago, a couple quarters ago. U.S. food prices have already risen more than 4% over the past 12 months, despite a 30% fall in oil prices over the same period. So this article was from a couple months ago. And energy prices could also start to climb in the geopolitical blink of an eye. I think OPEC's gonna, if oil prices continue to go up a little bit, OPEC's gonna keep bringing more production online because of how dependent on oil revenues the oil-produced national oil companies and OPEC countries are. So historically, a lot of OPEC countries, national oil companies, don't rely on market prices that much. Actually, it's counterintuitive. When oil prices fall, they actually increase production, at least in the past, over the past few decades. They don't cut production. OPEC has tried to enforce production cuts in the past, and they did not go so well. Trying to force production cuts. Some countries in the past actually massively increased oil production, trying to make it up on revenue temporarily because of how much of the government revenues are reliant on oil sales. Some of these countries, like Venezuela, was extremely reliant at one point on oil sales, and some of these other countries, 70, 80, and I think in Venezuela's case, 90% of all the dollars they're earning through export were on oil sales. And while the politicians and bureaucrats and people in the military, Hugo Chavez's cronies and now Maduro's cronies, were just stealing all those dollars from the oil sales. That's what I heard from my friends in Venezuela, the ones who escaped. Rising food prices may also seem counterintuitive given that record U.S. corn and soybean crops are forecast this year. Some areas of food production, such as meat and poultry, have adapted relatively well to the shock, though automation and meat. Actually, this is incorrect with the meat because there was a rapid rise in wholesale meat costs. I covered this, I think, in March or April. And I spoke to, when I ate at a steak dinner a couple months ago. Actually, yeah, it was a couple months ago at the Sweetwater Tavern. I went back there. I ate there, I think, in January, and it was $29 for the drunken ribeye. And then I went back about 6 weeks ago. And in only like 7 months difference, it went from $29 to $37. So it was a 27% increase in the exact same steak, the exact same drunken ribeye steak. So, and then I spoke to the waiter and the manager there, and they said that the wholesale beef prices are up enormously, and their other meat costs are also going up at the wholesale level. But some of the deflationists have said that these things are temporary, that it's only a supply chain shock. But I've been hearing this now for a long time. And when you go to the grocery store, the reality, when you actually buy things at the grocery store, that you have to eat every day, so you can't eat an iPad. So yes, maybe laptop prices and new computer prices, those things have fallen a lot over the last 20 years. And some of these countries actually subsidize their computer industries and semiconductor chip industry. So those things are subsidized, which most people don't take into account for in other countries. But there's been beneficial deflation to consumers in those small things, but you can't eat an iPad. So healthcare, food, a lot of these prices are not going down. There's not beneficial deflation to the consumer in many of these things. In fact, there's shrinkflation. And shrinkflation is something I wanted to spend a lot of time talking about for the rest of this live stream show. So John Maynard Keynes, Lord Keynes, said that, and I'm loosely paraphrasing here, about inflation, that roughly one in a million adults can actually understand inflation and be able to detect it and figure out what it is and understand it and actually see it. Well, shrinkflation, the amount of adults that can actually understand shrinkflation after conversations for the last 10 or 12 years with people is very, very low. And financial professionals, it's even lower than that. So for those of you not familiar with what shrinkflation is, it is the reduction in the size or weight of retail products or food items, especially items of packaged food, with no corresponding reduction in the retail price. So I've had discussions with people that will say, yes, there's lots of inflation, but I don't notice any food price inflation. Well, a lot of these food producers and restaurant companies, they even admit this on their conference calls. So for the last 6 or 7 years, if you go and look at the conference call transcripts, or you occasionally see the CEO on TV of a food company or restaurant company like Chipotle Grill, Mexican Grill, or others on TV talking about an interview, they've admitted that they've reduced the portion size. They've admitted that substantially. They've admitted that they've substituted higher cost ingredients for lower cost ingredients. And this is all part of shrinkflation, where the price for the consumer may not change that much, but the amount of food, the amount of consumer staple item that whether it's toilet paper, other things that the consumer is getting for the price paid is way higher. So this is cost per unit. So your cost per unit, the price stays the same, but you're getting way less units. You might be getting 20% less units quickly, 30%, 40% over a longer period of time. The cost per unit is up enormously. I remember this is just anecdotal, but if you've eaten at, I don't eat at Chipotle anymore right now, but I used to eat there all the time. So I have a good baseline to compare to. And many years ago, when I was eating at Chipotle Mexican Grill in college and right after college, the portion size back then for steak, for chicken, for carnitas, number one, the price was lower for the meat, and the amount of meat you got was insane. You got an enormous portion size. You got, I think, 3 or 4 large scoops of chicken, and now the portion size is a lot less, and the price for like chicken tacos or a chicken burrito or a chicken bowl is substantially more. So I think it was like $5.50 or $6, and now it's like $7.50 or $8 for a lot less chicken. So there are not accurate statistical measurements, economic statistical measurements tracking shrinkflation. However, there was one study done. It was by a British government agency. It was by I'm pulling it up right now. It was by the ONS, so the Office for National Statistics. They did a shrinkflation study of British consumer products a number of years ago, and they saw that like candy bars, the amount of chocolate, the size of the candy bars, they were down 10, 20, 30%, some of them, depending upon how the time frame that you looked at. So in shorter periods of time, some of the candy bars were down 9, 10, 12%, and over longer periods of time, they were down way, way more than that. And it was similar amounts for other food items as well. So the average person, the average Joe or Jane out there, Joe or Jane six-pack, does not understand shrinkflation. Maybe they will blame capitalism, or they notice that they're having to pay at the grocery store, like me today, earlier this afternoon. I bought a couple items and it was $60 at the grocery store. Maybe a couple years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, maybe those same items would have been $35, $40. So the prices at the grocery store are rising, and unfortunately, most Americans don't notice this, and most people in general, not just Americans, and especially financial professionals, because it does not fit the deflation narrative. But we do have food companies in the conference calls, in the management discussion and analysis section at restaurants, and at the food packaging, like the cereal companies, the companies that sell like cereals or potato chips. They've readily admit this, that they're doing this to try to maintain their profit margins, because a lot of these companies use a lot of leverage on their balance sheet. They did financial engineering, and if their profit margins collapsed because their input costs were rising, if they try to maintain the same portion of food, they would be in financial peril. This was before the pandemic. They would have been in even more financial peril. Jerry says, hey, Late Owl, I don't really have a choice because I'm disabled with my health problems. I'm on about $1,000 a month now of supplements and natural nootropics, just so that, and I have to do a 6-hour routine just so that way I can feel halfway decent to get 30 or 40 minutes out to do this content. Most people do not understand what I have to go through just to get this. It is very difficult for me. My life is very, very hard. We're talking, I have to spend a lot of money, and it's a long routine of things just to be able to get productivity for 30 minutes to an hour or two. That's how bad things are. Although now I am feeling a little better, but look, it only took 6 hours and all these nootropics and supplements. So things are going to be late. That's how I can't work a normal job anymore. That's just unfortunately how things are. And with YouTube taking away all my ad revenue, I'm probably going to have to find a paid advertiser. Or I'm going to have to move the live stream shows behind the paywall. Yes, there's tons and tons of examples of shrinkflation. There is no one tracking shrinkflation accurately. Absolutely no one. Because it makes the food companies look bad. It makes the restaurants look bad. And most importantly, it makes the governments look bad, because they're telling people They have to fight deflation. They're telling people that there's no inflation. They're telling people that those cost of living adjustments, don't worry, there's no inflation. So we have to fight deflation. We have to print. But most Americans are okay with that anyway. Libertarians are folding like lawn chairs now. Fake libertarians are folding like lawn chairs now. They're demanding... I got in a altercation with a fake libertarian yesterday. He was saying, I'm voting for whichever politician's going to give me the largest check. I was like, okay, fine. You're not really a libertarian, because there's plenty of solutions that you and your family and friends can figure out without wanting bigger government and without voting for the currency to be rapidly destroyed even faster than it already is. Be careful what you wish for. If you vote for MMT and universal basic income, if you think it's bad now at the grocery store, if you think it's bad now at Target or Walmart or Amazon with your bills, be careful what you wish for. Because the economy is not producing as many goods and services, and there will be even more currency and credit floating around. There are individual free market solutions without the government. Plenty of them. I've made them for years. I gave them out for free on my George Gammon interview. I spent 4 hours on that working on that PowerPoint presentation for how to survive and thrive and beat stagflation, tax, and lie. I gave that away for free. But it's way, way easier, requires no research whatsoever, to vote for the politician that promises you the most goodies. But we are a runaway train here. The currencies are going to be devalued. The best case scenario, stagflate, tax, lie. And most Americans are now on board, Republicans and Democrats and fake libertarians, with getting universal basic income and MMT checks. Okay, we have a question here from Mark Delgado. Question, Jason, do you think we are going to a digital currency? Yes, I've been talking about this only for the last 4 or 5 years. I've been tracking this before a lot of other people. And now you're seeing more and more press releases with progress report updates from all these governments and central banks. So it's a question of when and not if. And there was some idiot yesterday accusing me, saying I didn't know the difference between Bitcoin and a government cryptocurrency. I've been covering Bitcoin for a long time. I know Trace Meyer. I've been interviewing Bitcoin experts for a long time. I know Bitcoin has a fixed supply. Government cryptocurrency will not have a fixed supply. Okay, your crypto yuan, your crypto yen, your crypto euro, your crypto dollar, they will not have a fixed supply. Oh, they will. The government might tell us, but if you trust the government, I wish you the best of luck. Matthew says his bills are going to go up even as he tries to cut back on expenses. I only eat 1 meal a day now and my bills are still up. My healthcare bill is up enormously. My healthcare insurance is up enormously over the last 10 years, and I don't even go to the doctor. Danielle DiMartino Booth has talked about how the government intentionally counts the wrong indicators to underreport how much people's health insurance premiums are rapidly rising. I've spoken to people who've paid for their health insurance premiums for a family of 4, and I've seen their costs have about tripled over the last 10 or 15 years. And none of the government inflation data accounts for any of this. None. So shrinkflation is very, very important. You have to understand it. You have to study it. And you have to figure out what goods to maybe stockpile. What food to stockpile. Maybe grow your own garden like Dr. Chris Martinson says. Maybe figure out how to be more resilient or self-sufficient. Maybe buy meat from someone like Joel Salatin at Polyface Farms, or contact your local farmer. Because maybe if you're buying in advance, maybe in bulk, you're not going to get hurt by these price increases of beef and chicken and pork. There's an idea. You can maybe get a second freezer for cheap. There's tons of used second freezers for very, very cheap all over the place on Craigslist. You can go pick it up yourself. You can get it cheap. So you can have a second freezer. You can negotiate with your local farmer, local butcher, figure things out. Shrinkflation is going to be very, very bad. Shrinkflation has been bad for a long time, for decades, but it's shrinkflation, in my opinion, now that I've been doing this for over a decade, shrinkflation has accelerated a lot over the last 10 to 12 years. There is a very big notice in portion sizes and price increases. I remember when I was in college, I went to the Outback Steakhouse and I got a steak with a side salad and some with a side salad and like French fries or vegetables for like 16, 17 bucks for a pretty large steak. And now like it's nowhere near that. It's way more than that. So the cost for everything is going up. There's actually a book out by an Austrian school economist that says, whatever happened to penny candy? I think it's a kid's book about Austrian school economics. So I think Richard Maybury, what happened to penny candy? No, the answer is no one can afford to produce candy at a penny anymore, at a profit. So the main things to learn about here is expect with currency devaluation and the weather problems all over the globe, the African swine flu, demand for more protein out of China, that the price for meat protein is going to go a lot higher, like someone just said in the comment section. So pork, pork, beef, chicken, fish, those costs are probably going to rise, or there's going to be bad substitution. And the government economic data, the consumer price index, it makes substitution assumptions. So if it does not measure a price of fixed goods, it does not measure a basket of fixed goods where if you buy a steak, you buy a dozen eggs, you buy a gallon of milk, you buy a certain amount of cheese. It does not measure those things, the same basket of goods. It makes, for example, it makes an assumption that the consumer will substitute in their standard of living. So if the price of beef and steak rises too much, the consumer will get chicken. Or if the price of chicken rises too much, the consumer will switch to ground beef or dog food. Those are the assumptions built into the consumer price index. And it's only going to get more ridiculous. So understand shrinkflation, study shrinkflation, and prepare for shrinkflation. And I will attach articles below this in the information and description section. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And unfortunately, there's going to be a lot higher food prices in the not-too-distant future solely on currency devaluation because I do not see food production rapidly increasing. In fact, we might see some crops, there might be shortages, there might be underplanting, weather problems can cause distortions, and with demand for more meat protein out of China, the rest of the world is going to be competing then at a higher price point to eat the same amount of meat